Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the last day of the annual conference of the Central Bank of Brazil 2025. Once again, we highlight that for the organization of this conference, the Central Bank of Brazil has partnerships with the Credit Warranty Fund and the support of the following institutions: the Brazilian Association of Payment Institutions, ABIPAG, the Brazilian Association of Financial and Capital Market Entities, ANIBA, the Brazilian Federation of Banks, FEBRABAN, Zeta, Association of Technology Companies Operating in the Financial and Means of Payment Sector, the Association of Brazilian Banks, and the National Association of Credit, Financing and Investment Institutions, ACREFI. Just like in the last few days, we also greet the other sponsors. Just like in the other days, we will have a master class and then academic sessions in both auditoria. This session is being broadcasted through our YouTube channel. The sessions that will follow will be recorded and made available at a later date on the event website on the internet. To set up the opening table, we invite Paulo Picchetti, Deputy Governor of International Affairs and Corporate Risk Management for the Central Bank of Brazil, and Professor Frank Smets, Deputy Head of the Monetary and Economic Department and Head of Economic Analysis and Statistics at the Bank of International Settlements. We would now like to invite Deputy Governor Paulo to moderate the session.
Welcome to the third and last day of our conference. So continuing with our program, it is with great pleasure that we welcome today Professor Frank Smets, one of the leading figures in contemporary monetary economics. Professor Smets currently serves as Deputy Head of the Monetary and Economic Department and Head of Economic and Statistical Analysis at the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. He is part of the institution's senior leadership, contributing directly to the development of analysis and policies that impact the global financial system. Before returning to the BIS in 2024, Professor Smets has had a distinguished career at the European Central Bank, where he served as Director General of Economics, Advisor to the President, and Director General of Research. His academic background is equally impressive. He holds a PhD in economics from Yale University and is widely recognized for his contributions to topics such as monetary policy, business cycles, and financial stability. In 2023, he was awarded the Alexandre Lamfalussy Senior Research Fellowship by the BIS. Among his most recent publications are the articles Macroeconomic Modeling at the European Central Bank, Energy Shocks as Keynesian Supply Shocks, Implications for Fiscal Policy, and the Optimal Quantity of CBDC in a Bank-Based Economy, the latter published in the American Economic Journal, Macroeconomics. Today, Professor Smets will deliver a keynote lecture on the paper Fiscal Backing, Inflation, and U.S. Business Cycles, co-authored with Ralph Walters. In this work, the authors explore the interaction between fiscal policy, inflation, and business cycles in the United States, offering a fresh perspective on fiscal backing mechanisms and their effects on macroeconomic dynamics, a topic of great relevance for policymakers, regulators, and financial market participants. I invite everyone to take full advantage of this unique opportunity to hear from and engage with one of the most respected experts in monetary economics of our time. Thank you for coming here, Professor Smets, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. It's of course an honor and also a great pleasure to participate in this annual conference organized by the Banco Central do Brasil. I should say the usual disclaimer holds, so the views I express are mine and not necessarily those of the BIS. Let me see if I can. Sorry about that. As was mentioned, my talk will be about the fiscal origins of inflation. And in particular, I will be asking how does a monetary and fiscal policy regime affect the inflationary consequences of various shocks? Fiscal policy shocks, but also other shocks like supply shocks, to the extent that they have fiscal implications. And of course, I realize, and you made already a reference to it, that given Brazil's inflation history, this is a hotly debated topic in Brazil. If you look at the literature on the fiscal theory of the price level, which is one of the theories on which I will build, the first empirical application was to the Brazilian hyperinflation of the 1980s by Eduardo Loyo. And of course, many famous macroeconomists, including Tom Sargent, the Nobel Prize winner, and Olivier Blanchard, the former chief economist of the IMF, have looked at Brazil and Brazilian inflation to investigate the relationship between fiscal debt, fiscal deficits, and inflation. So here I am in Brasilia, but I won't be talking about the Brazilian experience, but about the recent US experience. So most of my presentation, as was mentioned, will be based on a joint paper with Raf Wouters from National Bank of Belgium, titled Fiscal Backing, Inflation and US Business Cycles. And this is the outline for my talk. So let me start with the motivation. I mean, the question that we really wanted to analyze in this paper is to understand the role of expansionary fiscal and monetary policy mix in the recent inflation surge, basically the post-pandemic inflation surge. So the focus is on the United States, and of course in the meantime there's quite a bit of work that also have looked at the cross-country experience. There is a very nice paper by Robert Barrow and Francesco Bianchi that kind of explains differences in inflation across countries on the basis of fiscal differences. But in this paper, we want to look at this through the lens of the standard New Keynesian model. Now, it's well known that the inflationary impact of a fiscal expansion in this model will depend on what you assume the monetary fiscal policy regime to be. In one extreme, which is sometimes called the fiscal dominance case or the fiscal-led regime, and this corresponds to the fiscal theory of the price level, the inflationary impact of an unfunded fiscal expansion may be very large. And proponents of this theory, like John Cochrane, who has written recently a whole textbook about it, have argued that the inflation surge that we saw after the pandemic was mostly due to the fiscal expansion in the US, for example, the Biden package, 1.9 trillion fiscal expansion. So that's one extreme. For that, you have to assume a certain monetary policy, fiscal policy regime, where monetary policy is basically passive and fiscal policy is active. In another extreme, and that's the more standard way of which we use those models at central banks. This is sometimes called the monetary dominance regime. The inflation impact may be actually quite limited of a fiscal expansion, partly because in those models, when there is an increase in the deficit and fiscal policy is passive in the sense that it will try to stabilize the debt and as a result will create surpluses in the future, then the impact on the economy will be relatively less because the agents in the economy will see, okay, now there is easing, but there will be tightening in the future, and so they don't actually respond very much. It's what's called in the literature sometimes Ricardian equivalence. And of course, if that's your monetary policy, fiscal policy regime that you assume, and again, that's the standard one where, no, it's the central bank that sets inflation, that responds to inflation by tightening real interest rates when inflation is above the target. In those regimes, you will have to look for other factors that explain this inflation surge. And I would say that I would associate more with economists like Ben Bernanke, or Olivier Blanchard that have highlighted the role of the negative supply shocks in the inflation surge. Some of them pandemic related, the fact that we had supply chain disruptions, bottlenecks in the economy because of COVID and lockdown measures, but also related to the rise in energy prices following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, increasing commodity prices, food prices, and so on and so forth. So one of the questions that we want to address in this paper is exactly, one way of saying who's right, or is it both factors that are important in terms of driving this inflation? Now, the second reason why before I go to the second reason, let me just give a plug for some recent research done by colleagues of mine at BIS, Banerjee, Boktor, Mehrotra, and Zampoli, where they indeed also empirically show evidence that this monetary fiscal policy regime will be important for determining the inflationary impact of a fiscal expansion. I mean, what you have here in this picture from left to right is basically 4 different monetary and fiscal policy regimes across, and the effects, so the bar is basically the effect of a 1% fiscal expansion on inflation. The little bars are sort of the differences across countries and differences, statistical difference in this procedure. And so what they do is they look across countries and then look at the fiscal policy regime, look at the monetary policy regime, and classify them either as sort of active fiscal policy, which means a lot of unfunded fiscal policy, versus more passive policy, where the surpluses respond to debt so that debt is stabilized. And they do the same for monetary policy. Active monetary policy, where the central bank follows something like the Taylor rule, that is, when inflation is above target, real interest rates are increased, versus passive monetary policy, where interest rates do not respond very much and real interest rates may even fall. And so then they look at these, so they classify, then they have 4 cases. No, it's a 2-by-2 quadrant. The left quadrant is basically the case where you have both sort of passive fiscal policy and active monetary policy. So that's sort of the monetary dominance regime. And you see the effect on inflation of a 1% fiscal expansion is very small. The second regime is the other extreme I was talking about. This is the fiscal dominance regime, where monetary policy is not very active, so it's passive. The real interest rate does not respond very much to deviations of inflation from the inflation target. And fiscal policy is active in the sense that it does not respond to debt. That's the case where inflation impact is the highest, as you would expect. The reason, of course, is that in this case, inflation, which is a form of default, will actually help finance the debt. And the two regimes to the right are more these mixed regimes. The last regime is a regime where fiscal policy is not well anchored, but monetary policy is very active and has a high degree of independence. The variability is a bit higher, but in that case, sort of the monetary policy seems to dominate in this sample. So this is just empirical evidence. Now, what we want to do in our paper, let me skip this, is provide a model that actually can tell us, through estimation, in which of those regimes we are. I mean, the problem is that in the canonical New Keynesian model, you either have to assume one of the two extremes, fiscal dominance or monetary dominance. And neither of those regimes are very attractive from a reality point of view. If you assume monetary-led regime, then actually fiscal policy has no impact in this particular model on the economy, on inflation and output, because of the representative agent nature of the structure and the Ricardian equivalence. And of course, we know that that's probably not reality. And the other extreme, the fiscal-led regime, is also not very attractive. Their fiscal policy will have big inflationary effects because it helps finance the debt that is unfunded. But actually, in that regime, monetary policy is counterproductive. If the central bank would raise interest rates, then it increases the interest rate burden of debt, and thereby may even increase inflation that's needed to stabilize debt. And so what we need, actually, is a model where we can think and talk about intermediate regimes, where part of the debt may be unbacked, may be unfunded, and the other part is funded. And so the central bank takes that into account. So it's a regime where fiscal policy generally commits to serve current debt by running future surpluses, but may not take the full burden of adjustment, whereas monetary policy is geared generally towards stabilizing inflation, but it may have to face the inflationary consequences of partially unfunded government debt. So that's more like the methodological contribution of our paper to think about these intermediate regimes. And so that's the kind of the three objectives of the paper, and what I will talk about in the rest of this presentation. We'll first develop a model which allows for these intermediate monetary fiscal policy regimes with partial fiscal backing, so move away from these extreme cases. And the degree of fiscal backing will be captured by a regime parameter, a policy regime parameter, which we will call lambda. And lambda basically gives you how well-funded fiscal policy is. So if lambda is 1 in our case, then basically we're back in the monetary regime that we all love at central banks. If lambda is 0, then we're in the fiscal dominant regime. That's the fiscal theory of the price level. And it's mostly fiscal policy that will determine the evolution of inflation. And again, when lambda is in between, there's a part of fiscal policy that's unfunded, and that will give rise to inflation expectations and inflation. And there's a part that will be funded and where inflation effects will be stabilized by the central bank. So in the first part, I will just show you through a very simple example how we do that. Then in the second part, we estimate a New Keynesian model with this partial fiscal backing for the US economy. And so the main difference with the standard Smets-Wouters model will be that now we add a fiscal block. We have fiscal reaction functions. And we can estimate not only the fiscal reaction function, the fiscal block, but also this parameter, regime parameter lambda. So how large is lambda in the US if we look on average over, let's say, the period since the 60s? So that estimate will then give you as a sense of, are we closer to a monetary dominance regime or are we closer to a fiscal dominance regime in the US. Using that model, we can then ask these questions. No? What is the average degree of fiscal backing? So that's how large is lambda? Are the most important drivers of inflation monetary or fiscal? We will be able to do a decomposition of US inflation in a kind of a fiscal inflation component and a monetary component. And then thirdly, how does the fact that you have such an intermediate regime, how does lambda affect the propagation of shocks, and particularly the propagation to inflation? This model we will estimate until the period, the end of 2019, just before the pandemic. But then we will use the estimated model to interpret the post-pandemic inflation surge and do a decomposition of the various contributions of the shocks. And particularly, of course, we will be interested in seeing what is the contribution of so-called fiscal inflation or the fiscal inflation component of various shocks. So that's what we want to do. What I want to do in the rest of the talk. Okay, let me give you a very simple illustration of how we implement these intermediate regimes. And I apologize for the equations here. This is a very linearized version, these 4 equations, of like the simplest macro model that one can think of. It's an endowed economy, flexible prices, and 1-period nominal government debt. The economy is basically described by 2 equations. The first one is the Fisher equation, which links the nominal interest rate to expected inflation. The real interest rate here will be actually a constant. The second equation is the linearized version of the government budget constraint. Current debt, BT, nominal debt, depends on past debt. It depends on interest rates, it depends on inflation, pi t, and it depends on tau t, which is the primary surplus. So it's just a linearized version of the government budget constraint. And then you have 2 policy reaction functions. You have the monetary policy reaction function, which again, in its simplest form, just says that the interest rate responds to inflation. And the psi parameter here will be the important policy parameter. If that psi is greater than 1, then it means that real interest rates respond positively to deviations of inflation from the target. So monetary policy is tightened when inflation is above target. When this psi is 1 or less than 1, then actually you have passive monetary policy. So when inflation goes up, actually real rates go down, and which then stimulates the economy. And the last equation is the fiscal policy reaction function, so which basically says how the primary surplus is determined, tau t. It's a function of the debt. If debt is high, above some steady state level, then the surplus is increased to stabilize that debt. It will also depend on a shock, which is the epsilon tau t. So that will be our fiscal shock that we are analyzing. So that's kind of the simplest flexible price endowment economy that we can use, where we still have both monetary and fiscal policy reacting. And so the 2 regimes I was talking about, the monetary dominance versus, or monetary-led versus fiscal-led regime, will depend on the policy parameters psi for monetary policy and delta b for fiscal policy. So what happens if you are in an active monetary policy, passive fiscal policy regime, the monetary-led regime? In that case, the psi is greater than 1 and the delta is positive. So fiscal policy responds to that. And you shock the economy with a 1% increase in the deficit. So what you see here on the left side is the deficit to GDP, the primary surplus to GDP ratio. So you get a deficit shock of 1%. The middle bar component gives you the inflation response. In this monetary regime, inflation does not respond. The debt ratio on the right-hand side goes up and then falls because following the deficit, the government creates a surplus responding to the increase in debt, and then the debt falls. And the impact on inflation in this case is zero. There's no impact. So that's the monetary policy, the monetary dominance regime, which you will get if psi is greater than 1, the Taylor principle holds, and delta is sufficiently large so that debt is stabilized. There is, and again, this is Leeper's seminal work, there is another sort of stable regime in this economy, which is this fiscal-led regime. So in that case, the psi is less than 1, and the response of the surplus to that is not sufficiently strong. And we look now in the same economy, but with this different policy regime, fiscal-led regime, to the same shock. So again, we have a deficit shock of 1%. Now we get exactly the opposite if we look at the impact on inflation and on debt. Now, because the agents in the economy realize that is an unfunded debt, there won't be future surpluses to pay back the debt. They expect inflation, and actual inflation jumps up. So inflation jumps up. In equilibrium, and again, of course, this is a very simple example, but equilibrium so much that actually the nominal debt doesn't rise. No? So this is basically an inflation-financed fiscal expansion. So that's the other regime. Now, what we want to do now is actually have a regime which is somewhere in between, where part of the debt is unfunded, will give rise to inflation, because everybody understands that, whereas other part is funded, will be followed by. And so the way we do it is by basically defining the pi FT, which some have called fiscal inflation. So now the central bank responds to the deviations of actual inflation from some time-varying fiscal inflation target. And that fiscal inflation is exactly enough to finance the unfunded debt, which is the BFT minus 1. So in the fiscal policy reaction function, now the surplus only responds to the funded debt, so the deviation of actual debt from the unfunded part. And fiscal inflation and this unfunded part, which are sort of consistent with each other, are determined in a shadow economy that basically runs under fiscal dominance. And they are determined by how much of the shock is unfunded. And so that's the last box there, which is the 1 minus lambda epsilon t. So the lambda is basically the share of the debt that is funded. So if lambda is 1, then basically in fiscal inflation and unfunded debt will be 0. We're back in the monetary-led regime. If lambda is 0, then actually the economy acts like a fiscal-led regime. And just to implement that in the graphs, so here we start again from the monetary-led regime, the same fiscal shock. If we now assume that 25% of that debt that is created by this fiscal expansion is unfunded, then, then you see what happens to inflation and debt. So you get now part of the debt is unfunded, so you get this inflation impulse response, and part of the debt will be devalued, and so you get lower debt response. And so as you then move to the fiscal-led regime, so a larger part of the debt is unfunded, the inflationary effects will be higher. The effects on debt, again, the nominal value of debt, I would say the debt ratio should be lower. And so in the extreme, when lambda is 1, you're back to the fiscal dominance regime. So this is basically so this is in a very small economy. You can do the same in an economy which is a little bit more realistic. Let's say we assume price stickiness. So now we have a Phillips curve. We have a forward-looking IS curve. We introduce some nominal long-term debt that, of course, will increase the power of inflation to actually devalue the real value of debt. But basically, it's the same structure. You can generalize the monetary policy and real policy, fiscal policy reaction functions. And then you're going to look at different shocks. So the two shocks I want to look at, again, is this tau T shock, which is a fiscal shock, so a fiscal expansion. But now I also want to look at potential output shock or a supply shock, a negative supply shock. That's an epsilon AT. So that will basically lower output and increase inflation. To show you that also in response to other shocks, this fiscal monetary policy regime will be important. So let me just show you how in this more general model the economy responds. And I won't talk about the calibration, but sort of a standard calibration. So now here on the lower middle panel, we have, again, the primary surplus, the fiscal expansion, 1% fiscal expansion, because of the reaction function being a bit more general with lagged behavior and so on. It's a bit more gradual. In this new Keynesian economy with monetary dominance, so monetary-led regime, so lambda is 1, because of the representative agent and Ricardian equivalence, actually fiscal in this economy, in spite of also the price stickiness, there's no impact on the economy. The only thing that happens is the debt ratio goes up, and then it comes down as the current deficit is corrected by future surpluses. As you have more unfunded debt, then basically you get some of these inflation effects. But now, because of the price stickiness, you will also get some growth effects. And as a result, the initial primary deficit will be a bit less, and the debt ratio will rise by less. And again, as you have more, larger lambda, so a larger, sort of a smaller lambda, so a larger degree of unfundedness, you will have larger impacts on inflation and the economy, and less impact on the debt ratio. And of course, you see that the real interest rate in those cases will become negative, because the central bank does not respond. What I want to show you using this example is that this type of mechanism, so the fact that inflationary effects will depend on the fiscal monetary policy regime, also works in response to other shocks. It's not only in response to a fiscal shock. So this is like this negative supply shock. So output on the upper left has a negative, it's a negative output shock. Inflation responds positively because productivity falls, marginal cost increases with sticky prices. That leads to an increase in inflation. The central bank responds, this is the nominal interest rate, by tightening monetary policy, not only nominally, but also real, on the left lower spot. And because the economy is in recession, you create a deficit. You have a deficit because there are some automatic stabilizers in this reaction function. So you have, and also the denominator of the surplus to the GDP ratio falls. So the deficit increases. So you create a deficit, and some debt will accumulate as a result to this negative supply shock. This is in the monetary-led regime, so where the central bank controls inflation by raising interest rates in response to the inflationary impulse. Again, what happens if part of the debt that is created through this negative shock is actually perceived to be unfunded? So it will not be followed by surpluses, as you can see in the middle column. You have basically the same effect. So you basically increase the inflationary effects of this negative supply shock. So this is the case when 25% is unfunded. 50%, 75%. If nothing of this debt is unfunded, you get a much larger inflation response. It has the advantage that the economy, the recession is a little bit less, as you can see on the left-hand side. And the primary surplus will be also a bit less because you basically create inflation. You have a little bit of higher growth. As a result, the debt ratio doesn't increase as much. The interest rate burden doesn't increase as much. The primary surplus doesn't need to increase as much. Okay, so what I want to do in the next part is use this methodology. I basically showed you the kind of the economic effects of assuming these intermediate regimes. Now I want to put this in a more realistic, basically medium-sized New Keynesian model, and I want to estimate how large is lambda actually for the US on average over this period. I should say that in most of the baseline results, we assume that the monetary fiscal policy regime is fixed, so the lambda is fixed. But we have in the paper also cases where we look at variation over time and test whether there is variation over time, and also whether this lambda may be different depending on the shock that hits the economy. And I'll come back to that if I have time at the end. So basically what we do is we take the Smets-Wouters model, which is, I guess, the model I kind of know, and we add a fiscal block in that model. So 4 additional fiscal observables: market value of government debt, growth rate of taxes, transfers, and government spending. We add 4 fiscal shocks: spending shock, transfer shock, tax shock. And then we implement this methodology where with the intermediate regime, the lambda, so we allow for the central bank to have this time-varying inflation target and for the government to only respond to the deviation of debt from an unfunded part. So these are the results of, or part of the results of this estimation. This is estimated, I think, 1965 to 2019. So again, it's an average. And you could argue that in the 70s, maybe the lambda was smaller than in the Great Moderation period. And maybe, again, lambda was larger during the lower bound period and so on. But we can, for now, assume that it's, want to estimate a constant. Now, the first parameter that I show here is the lambda, and the estimates of the intermediate regime are the middle column. And you see, so lambda on average is estimated to 0.83 in this. So on average, the US monetary policy, fiscal policy regime over this whole period is closer to a monetary-led regime, which would be lambda is 1. And that's, there you have some of the estimates for lambda is 1, which is sort of the standard assumption when we estimate these models, versus, and it's quite far away from a fiscal-led regime, which would be a lambda of 0. If you look at the differences in log likelihood, I mean, it's statistically, the intermediate regime is statistically different from the monetary-led regime, but the difference, I mean, the log difference is around 8, I think, which is usually sort of seen as statistically significant, but it's not very different. Whereas it's very different, very far away from the fiscal-led regime. Then you can look at some of the other estimates, but I won't, parameter estimates, but I won't expand on that. Just to say, of course, because there's a fiscal block now, you can also see what's the delta B, how responsive is the various fiscal components to that. For the US, what we find is that it's actually the transfers that are most responsive to the debt, and that sort of make sure that the debt ratio is stable after all. Using that model and these estimations, we can then see, okay, how large is the importance of fiscal inflation or unfunded fiscal inflation in the US. And so you see the development of CPI inflation in the US over the estimation period. The blue part is sort of the monetary, what we call the monetary-led inflation. The orange part is the fiscal-led inflation. So for the US, basically what we find, and that's consistent with some other literature that kind of tries to estimate switches in monetary fiscal policy regimes, there is a significant contribution to inflation in the 60s and the 70s. Then not much during the Great Moderation period. And then following the global financial crisis, there is again a significant fiscal inflation component, which you see at the end. I mean, we can then take this model to see, okay, this fiscal inflation, does it come from fiscal shocks? Or does it come from other shocks? No, and so that's basically a decomposition. It's not a very nice graph, but it's a decomposition of only the fiscal inflation component that you saw in the previous. The black parts are basically the fiscal inflation, the inflation driven by fiscal shocks. And you see that, again, in the most recent period, these have been important drivers. The point I want to make here is that particularly supply shocks also have a fiscal component. So when you have a supply shock, and particularly the energy price shocks in the 70s, you see they have, the blue part, they have an important contribution to the inflation in the 70s. And again, the interpretation is the following. You have here a period of productivity slowdown in the US, increased energy prices because of the various OPEC-related shocks. That leads to a reduction in growth. It leads to an increase in the deficit, an increase in the debt ratio. What this model says that about 20% of that was unfunded and gave rise to additional inflationary impulse. And so that's what you see here in the blue contributions. I mean, then we can look at, so the third question I had was, how does the fact that part of the debt is unfunded affect the transmission of shocks? I mean, the fiscal shocks I'm not going to repeat. Given the way we set up the model, where there's no inflation effects of fiscal shocks in the monetary regime, all of the inflation effects that we see is basically driven by fiscal inflation in relation to this shock. So that's an important source of inflation propagation. Also, when you are in this regime, the multiplier will be larger. The multiplier on growth will be larger than in the monetary policy regime. So that's what you see in the impact on output. Let me have a look at the negative price markup shock. So that's for example, could be a commodity price shock or an energy price shock. You see, it leads to a fall in output. It leads to a drop in the surplus, or to a deficit. And it leads to inflation, so that's the solid line. And again, the dashed lines basically give you the fiscal inflation component in that propagation. And you see, if you look at the middle upper panel, that you see that what the fiscal channel does, it basically increases the inflationary effect of a negative supply shock. We don't find much fiscal inflation effects in response to a monetary policy tightening. So we have, in this model, we have the usual results that when interest rates increase, when there's a tightening of monetary policy, the economy slows down, inflation slows down. You create a bit of a fiscal deficit because of the slowdown in the economy. But when you compare the regime, full monetary dominance regime with this intermediate regime, the inflation component is not. So monetary policy transmission is not that much affected by this degree of fiscal backing. And the same is true for standard demand shocks. So the fiscal inflation is particularly important in response to fiscal shocks and to negative supply shocks. And of course, that already tells you that maybe there was also a role in the most recent inflation surge. And that's basically where we are next. So we now use this model with the intermediate regime and use it to decompose the inflation, the post-pandemic inflation surge in the US. So what you have, the top line here is inflation from 2020, quarter one, to I think it's 24, quarter two, I think is the end, the last. So basically inflation had more or less almost come back to target by the end of 2024. So the first column, and the second row gives you the impact on output. And then each of those panels, you have a decomposition. Blue is basically the contribution of supply shocks, so we bundle all the supply shocks together. Green is the contribution of demand shocks. So again, we have various demand shocks, we bundle them together and look at the contribution to inflation and output. The gray part is the fiscal shocks, so that's a contribution of the fiscal packages. Sorry. And the red part is monetary policy, so has a small negative contribution to inflation. Remember, monetary policy was at the lower bound, and so that may explain a little bit why there was some contribution here. And then we decompose this total effect, which is the first column, in terms of the funded and the unfunded part. I mean, I won't spend much more time on this graph, just let me give you the bottom line. I mean, the bottom line is that, as you can see, there is actually a quite important component of about 4 percentage points, a contribution, 4 percentage points of fiscal inflation. That's on the right-hand side what you see. And most of that is driven by the fiscal packages in the US. That's the gray part. But if you look at the timing of these effects with respect to the inflation surge, which particularly took place also in 2022, then it's mostly the negative supply shocks that contribute to that. That's the blue part. So this decomposition, the interpretation of this decomposition is basically, what it says is basically the following. Yes, fiscal expansion in the US did contribute, and actually quite significantly, 2-3 percentage points to inflation. But the bulk of that effect, and that corresponds with the timing of the packages, was a bit earlier than the peak inflation effect. It was more in 2021 and 22. And it more or less offset the negative demand shocks, which is the green part, caused by the COVID shock. So if you net out the fiscal effects and the negative demand effects, then more or less you're left with the blue part, which is which corresponds quite a bit with the peak of inflation in 2023. So the message of this decomposition, or the answer to the last question I put up, meaning who's right? Is Cochrane right, or is Bernanke Blanchard? There was this debate at the AEA 2 years ago where they were debating against each other. The message is a balanced or nuanced one, in the sense that if you really look at the peak inflation, most of it is negative supply shock, so that's Bernanke, Blanchard. But if you think about the build-up of inflation before that, then it's an important contributor has been the fiscal expansion. But to some extent, that fiscal expansion has offset the negative demand effects of the COVID recession. Okay, so that basically, I think, ends most of my presentation. So these are the questions I asked and the answers I gave. I don't need to repeat those. Let me just end with some follow-up that we did and also some robustness analysis that we did in the paper. First of all, we did look at whether the degree of fiscal backing is different in response to different shocks. And more or less what we find, and to some extent that's also intuitive, we find that the lambda is actually lower, it should say lower. So there's less fiscal backing for fiscal and supply shocks. It's higher for demand shocks. And we have some follow-up work where we look at the optimality of the degree of fiscal backing that would correspond to that. Has it changed over time? Yes, there is some weak evidence that it changed over time, that fiscal backing was much less in the 60s, 70s. Then there was almost full fiscal backing in the Great Moderation period. And then after the global financial crisis, fiscal backing dropped again and fiscal inflation became again important. We do some robustness analysis with respect to other models. Obviously, our baseline model is a very stark model where fiscal transfers don't matter. If we take a more realistic model where there is some, Keynesian effects of transfers, because some agents are credit constrained, so it's not a fully Ricardian model. We still get the result that this lambda parameter is significantly different from one. So the fact that you have other channels through which fiscal policy drives inflation doesn't fully undo our analysis. And then, okay, there's some other questions. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Professor Smets. This has been a very relevant topic and contribution. After the trade shocks somehow dissipate, the fiscal discussion will still be there and probably will be increasingly relevant in the US and other jurisdictions. So we still have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. I guess you can, but maybe people online won't hear you, so the mic is coming. Just wait a bit. Is the mic coming?
Thanks, Frank. Great presentation. One question, maybe you can elaborate. It's outside the scope of the model, but would be helpful for also the Brazilian context. In the model, expectations are always anchored, right? So the way you handle this thing, so there is this other target that evolves over time as a function of these partially unfunded fiscal policy. And people understand that, so they say, okay, there's part of inflation here which the central bank is not going to fight and shouldn't fight because, if there's no funding, otherwise you get into the fiscal theory, let's say, component. That's my understanding. But expectations are always anchored in the way we think about it. Whereas in reality, for example, here in Brazil, we have challenges with unanchored expectations, to some extent at least associated with fiscal policy. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the policy challenges for this. It's outside the scope of the model, but I think it would be helpful to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Do you prefer to take all questions or answer them?
I can answer. Well,
please.
as you wish.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah. It works automatically. Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Carlos. No, this is, I think, a key question for if you want to think about the practical relevance of this analysis. This is a regime where it's actually a cooperative regime, as you said, and where everybody also understands that this is a cooperative regime with actually an inflation target in the background. And so it may be a good description for regimes where indeed the credibility of both the fiscal and the monetary policy framework is consistent with that. If you don't have that, and of course no regime anywhere is fully credible, then it may be actually quite dangerous for the central bank to accommodate these type of shocks. Because indeed, if there is lack of credibility, then inflation expectations may respond, and then of course you will get into some of these negative dynamics. So I think that's really key. I mean, one situation where this actually can help to have like a discussion of the degree of backing is when you're at the lower bound, because then monetary policy is constrained. Nevertheless, inflation is actually in that case below the target, possibly, and then of course unbacked fiscal policy can help bring inflation back. So it's very the framework that the model uses is very different from a situation where there is like a hyperinflation or
Hi. I was wondering, in this type of model, usually when you think about the regime switching, you also have an effect when you expect, like when you are in a regime and you expect that this regime is going to change in the future, you have a different result. I was wondering about your fiscal backing parameter. As you said, it wasn't constant in the past. So in your model, did you think about like how the role of the expectation of this change of the lambda in the future, how this could affect your results?
Yes, so to some extent it would be a less extreme case of, there's a literature on regime switching models, and so in that literature you indeed see the higher the probability of switching to a fiscal dominant regime, the more the inflation effects will already take place in the monetary dominance regime. Something similar will happen here. If the agents in the economy know that actually the level of unfunded debt will increase in the future, then that will immediately have already an impact on inflation. And the reverse. If the expectation is that actually it will revert to an inflation targeting regime, then actually that stabilizes. And again, it's also why it's important to have this sort of full credibility.
Any other question?
Thank you for the presentation. In your analysis of the decomposition of the post-pandemic inflation, we see that there is this negative demand contribution to inflation. And I think, I don't know if it's a consensus, but there is this view that the US had some sort of immaculate disinflation, and it was showing a stronger growth in GDP consumption than other advanced economies. If you have some comment on that, how do you really think that the US was showing a negative output gap or something like that in those years? So is this how we should interpret those results you showed us?
Yeah, so, okay, if you want to compare to some of the analysis that has been done that looks at demand versus supply, of course you would have to combine the fiscal contribution, which is a demand contribution, with the other demand shocks, which is more like, in the model, these are like risk premium type of shock. So it's a tightening of financial conditions through the COVID crisis. If you could add both, then you get a bit of a positive contribution, but not much. So, and that's so on net. This decomposition says it was mostly negative supply shocks, but I mean, whether I would fully believe that is another question.
We have time for one last question. I see someone in the back.
Hello, thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, I guess you still didn't estimate the model for, I don't know, other countries, like developing countries, but I was wondering if you do, for example, Brazil or other developing countries, the lambda estimate would reflect the fact that maybe US are in a stronger position regarding the currency, so maybe the effect of unfunded debt maybe not so strongly reflecting the inflation, and if you do so, if you imagine it with this model without having to model, like, for example, open economy, only this lambda would reflect could lead to a higher impact on inflation because of the unfunded debt. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that your intuition, I think, is right. So if you want to apply this to an emerging market, I think it would be important, first of all, to have an open economy version, and secondly, to include the exchange rate, because the exchange rate will be an important indicator of how much inflation is expected because of the increase in unfunded debt. And the fact that we know as a stylized fact that pass-through of exchange rate is also faster in emerging market economies. I mean, that will affect some of the propagation effects. It won't affect sort of the basics, but it will affect some of the propagation of the shock, as it does in other models. But it would be important to have a role for the exchange rate, because that plays a very important role, both in transmission and as an indicator of what the market thinks about how funded the fiscal expansion is.
So unfortunately, this is all the time we've got, but it was a real treat. So I would like you to join me in thanking Professor Smets once again with a last warm round of applause.
Thank you.
Os nossos agradecimentos ao professor Paulo Picchetti, diretor de Assuntos Internacionais e de Gestão de Riscos Corporativos do Banco Central do Brasil, e ao palestrante de hoje, o professor Frank Smets. Mais uma vez, após o intervalo, a sessão acadêmica de macroeconomia acontecerá neste auditório, Otávio Gouveia de Bulhões, e a sessão de microeconomia acontecerá no auditório ao lado, do outro lado do hall, auditório Dênio Nogueira. Até o momento estivemos ao vivo pelo canal do Banco Central do Brasil no YouTube, e a palestra de hoje também permanecerá disponível.
Today's lecture is also going to remain available for future references. The academic sessions that are going to take place after the coffee break, they are going to be recorded and going to be made available on our website on the internet. We're going to have a 30-minute coffee break. We would like to invite all of you to enjoy the coffee break with us. Thank you very much.